What if the man who spent his entire life making you feel safe was secretly carrying something painful that he never let you see? What if the kindest face on television was hiding a truth so deep, so personal, that even his own wife stayed quiet about it for years? Before Fred Rogers died, Joanne Rogers, the woman who knew him better than anyone else on earth, made a promise to herself to protect his image, to keep the private things private. But then something changed. And the truth she finally decided to share is not what you would expect. It is not a scandal. It is not a secret life. It is something far more real than that. And once you hear it, you will never look at Mr. Rogers the same way again. Most people think they already know Fred Rogers. They picture the soft cardigan, the gentle smile, and that warm voice asking, "Won't you be my neighbor?" For millions of kids who grew up watching his show, he was not just a TV host. He was the one person who made them feel like they truly mattered. In a world full of noise, Fred Rogers was stillness. In a world that rushed past children, he slowed down and looked them right in the eye. His show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, ran for over 30 years on PBS, producing 895 episodes, and not one of them had a laugh track. Not one tried to trick kids with flashy colors or loud sounds. Every single episode was built on one simple idea, that you, exactly as you are enough. When the show first aired in 1968, nothing like it had ever been on television. Fred would walk through the front door, hang up his jacket, put on his famous cardigan sweater, tie on his sneakers, and sing directly to the kids watching at home. He talked about things that other shows were too scared to touch: divorce, death, anger, fear, loneliness. And he never talked down to children, never pretended those feelings did not exist. Instead, he sat down, looked straight at the camera, and helped young viewers understand that whatever they were feeling was completely okay. The show also had a magical place called the neighborhood of make-believe, where puppets like Daniel Tiger and King Friday played out little dramas that secretly taught big emotional lessons. And Fred voiced many of those puppets himself. Guests like Yo-Yo Ma, Tony Bennett, and even Coco the gorilla visited the neighborhood over the years, and every single one of them was treated with the same warmth and respect Fred gave to his youngest viewers. That was not an act. That was Fred Rogers. But here is what most people do not know. Behind every version of Fred Rogers that the world got to love, there was one person standing quietly in the background holding everything together. And her name was Joanne Bird. Born in 1928 in Jacksonville, Florida, Joanne grew up in a home that valued music, strong conversation, and real thinking. She became a piano prodigy before most kids her age had even discovered a hobby. And by the time she arrived at Rollins College in Florida, she was already turning heads, not because she was chasing attention, but because the music she played carried something extra, something that felt like honesty, like soul, like the kind of feeling people recognize even if they cannot name it. Joanne was sharp, funny, grounded, and deeply independent. And she had no interest in becoming anybody's quiet little wife because she already had a whole life of her own in motion. That is exactly where Fred Rogers found her, not because she needed to be found, but because their paths kept crossing in music halls and rehearsal rooms until neither one of them could imagine walking away. They were both music majors at Rollins in the late 1940s, both completely devoted to their craft, and both about to discover that the most important music they would ever make was not on any stage. What caught Joanne's attention about Fred was not his looks or his plans for the future. It was the way he listened, really listened, and the way he treated every single person he met like they were the most important person in the room. Their relationship grew slowly and honestly through practice rooms and long conversations, and after college, when life pulled them apart geographically. With Fred going to New York to work at NBC and Joanne staying behind, the letters never stopped. Long handwritten letters full of feeling and trust, and something that was clearly growing into something neither of them could ignore. Until one day, tucked inside one of those letters was a marriage proposal that made Joanne so excited she ran to the nearest phone booth to say yes, almost losing the letter on the way there. They got married in 1952 and stayed married for over 50 years. Now here is where things get interesting, and where the story most people think they know starts to crack just a little. Fred Rogers looked effortless on camera, calm, peaceful, like he had never had a bad day in his life. But Joanne has been very clear that that calm was not something Fred was simply born with. It was something he worked at every single day. She once told interviewers that her husband was no saint, and she meant that with love and total honesty. Because Fred got tired, he struggled, he doubted himself, and he felt the weight of millions of children depending on him, and sometimes that weight was crushing. He kept strict routines like swimming every morning and keeping his weight at exactly 143 pounds for most of his adult life, because that number meant something deeply personal to him. 1 letter in I for letters in love, 3 letters in you. He built his entire daily life around that quiet message. But living up to that message, being the kindest and most patient version of yourself every single day, takes a toll that cameras never show. Inside their home, the balance between Fred and Joanne was not always perfectly split either, because Joanne has openly talked about the fact that she was usually the one doing the hard disciplining when it came to raising their 2 sons, James and John. Fred was always the gentle one, and while that was a beautiful quality, gentleness is not always what parenting needs. So Joanne stepped into the harder role so Fred could stay who he needed to be. She protected his creative space, absorbed the stress, understood his silence, and his deeper layers that very few people ever got close enough to see. And she never tried to change any of it. What Joanne gave Fred was something no award show could ever recognize. She gave him permission to be both good and broken at the same time. And she was the reason he could walk out in front of that camera every single day and make the whole world feel loved. And now we get to it. The truth that Joanne Rogers held close for years before she finally decided the world deserved to know. It is not a scandal. The awful truth Joanne revealed is something far more painful than any scandal, because it is something every single person who has ever loved someone deeply will understand completely. Fred Rogers was diagnosed with stomach cancer in late 2002, and at first the signs were easy to dismiss: a little discomfort, some indigestion, the kind of thing a busy man with a full life pushes to the back of his mind. Joanne remembers how Fred quietly tried to manage it himself for as long as he could, adjusting what he ate, being patient with his body, not wanting to make it a big deal. But the pain kept growing, and when they finally got the answers they were looking for, the news was devastating. The cancer had already spread, and there was not much time left. The man who had spent his entire career helping children face the hardest feelings of their lives now had to face the hardest feeling of his own. What happened in those final months is what Joanne could not stay silent about forever, because Fred kept going even as his body was failing. Even after surgery took part of his stomach and treatments drained his energy, he appeared as the Grand Marshal of the Rose Parade in Pasadena in January 2003, just weeks before he passed away, standing in the cold and waving to crowds, honoring a commitment he had made long before the diagnosis. Because that was who he was, not a man performing kindness for cameras, but a man who genuinely believed that showing up for others was worth whatever it cost him personally. Back at home when his strength was nearly gone, Joanne would watch him sit at the piano, his fingers weaker, his body tired, but the music still coming. And those quiet moments became something she described as some of the most peaceful and heartbreaking experiences of her life. He passed away at home on February 27, 2003, surrounded by the people he loved most, one day after his grandson's birthday, at 74 years old. For years after Fred died, Joanne stayed quiet, guarding his privacy carefully and lovingly the way she always had. But as time passed, she realized that keeping this part of the story hidden was not protecting Fred. It was actually doing him a disservice. Because the truth of how Fred Rogers faced illness and fear and death is not a dark stain on his legacy. It is the most human and powerful part of it. She began opening up in documentaries and interviews, talking about what it felt like to become his caregiver, talking about the grief that hit her in waves even years later, saying that some days she felt energized and some days completely depleted, because grief does not follow a schedule, and there is no point at which you are simply done. Joanne did not stop living after Fred died either. She became chair emerita of Fred Rogers Productions, appeared in the 2019 film A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, continued to play piano, and kept showing up in public to remind people why kindness still matters, until she passed away on January 14, 2021, at the age of 92 in their Pittsburgh home, surrounded by loved ones, having spent nearly 18 years making sure his message never stopped breathing. The state of Pennsylvania had already made May 23rd, the 143rd day of the year, an official holiday in Fred's honor, a day dedicated to doing something kind, saying something thoughtful, and being a good neighbor. So the awful truth Joanne Rogers finally broke her silence to share is not something dark or shameful. It is something deeply and achingly human. Fred Rogers was afraid. He hurt. He doubted. He leaned on people. He needed to be cared for, not just the other way around. And he still showed up. Every single day, in that cardigan with those sneakers, and that voice that made the whole world feel a little safer. He still showed up. That is not a flaw in his story. That is the whole point of it. And if this story moved you even a little, hit that like button right now. Drop a comment below telling us your earliest memory of Mr. Rogers. Subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss what comes next. And go check out the next video already waiting for you on your screen.